Okay, can someone just please confirm that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Amazing. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I have experience with some teams in this room, so I want to remind the panel of one thing. I don't care how much economic jargon anybody knows, and I don't care if they were born in the US or not. Debates are won in analysis, not jargon. Just remember that. Okay, how does monetary policy affect the economic policy and economic situations of other countries? Largely, it is to the exchange rate of the dollar, which is to say, an increase in supply of the dollar, simultaneously devaluation in the value of a single unit of the dollar, means that countries have their debt denominated in the dollar. Most countries in the world, nota bene, now have an easier time paying off their debts. The opposite happens when the value of the dollar grows, meaning that their debt also grows proportionally to that increase in value. Secondly, insofar as this means that the Fed now has an extended mandate, which it currently doesn't have, it probably means it has some influence over the interest rates that the US sets to other countries when it loans or when it engages in the financial market. What do we think then? We think insofar as this becomes part of the Fed's calculus, it is going to lead to some level of devaluation of the dollar, some level of policy which increases the money supply, insofar as that is what limits negative effects on foreign economics. We don't think that this is going to lead to some crazy inflationary policy, because the Fed still has domestic mandates, and the Fed still has a bunch of regulations imposed upon it after numbers of crises, like 2008 crisis, meaning that we're not going to get some radical policy, but there is going to be a trend towards the increase of money supply and a trend towards dollar devaluation, insofar as this is a consideration. Oh, has a clarification, yeah?
So insofar as any country whose business cycle is out of sync with the US's will be adversely impacted, what share of countries or global GDP have to be affected before the Fed does things not in America's interest?
I think that largely it's going to be based on evaluation of the combination of foreign economics and US interests. I think based on the situation, based on how likely this is to create an economic crisis, how likely this have economic repercussions, that's going to be the end point for a decision. But I'm going to explain how this is actually going to be a mutually beneficial decision for both of the things that you raise in your clarification. First of all, what is the benefit of this? Say overall, it's going to be easier for countries that have their debt denominated in dollar to pay back their debt. Why? First of all, because overall, given the trend of devaluation, this means they have less debt, but also the policies more unpredictable insofar as there exists a trend, at least more than does today, meaning they're better able to plan paying back their debts. Why is this good? First of all, because insofar as denominating your debt in the dollar is something that is a negative thing, and the US having a policy which, increases your debt is something that's bad for the economy. This causes a couple of things. First of all, they have an incentive to denominate their debt in other currencies, meaning they politically turn to countries such as China and the renminbi. But secondly, insofar as it creates anti-US sentiment, i.e. the US is literally baiting us into a debt trap, I think this increases political buy-in for countries to move into things like the BRI. So I think that this means things like predatory loans, i.e. you get infrastructure, but this infrastructure is taken away from you. This means political conditionality, meaning that China gives you electricity, but they tell you we're going to shut down your electricity if you don't do what we say. This means that people in these countries lose sovereignty over their territory, over their infrastructure, and over their governments. The comparative is that the United States of America, through bilateral agreements, very often conditions things like improvement in democracy and human rights, but secondly, through institutions like the IMF, enforces conditions which are good for these countries economically, insofar as they do things like privatization, reducing tariffs, and all these things. They encourage trade liberalization, which encourages more investment and diversification of these countries' economies. We lose all of these things when they go to other actors. Secondly, there's going to be less default in these countries overall, meaning that insofar as it's easier for them to pay off their debts, people have an easier life on the ground, the most tangible impact in this debate. But secondly, there's going to be less instability in these countries. Insofar as economic instability engenders things like violence, engenders things like the creation of paramilitary groups which challenge governments, which in the end leads to bloodshed and destabilization of democracy. We think that's a benefit on our side of the house. But lastly, and this is my answer to OSPOI, we can consider the interests of the US and the interests of the global economy simultaneously. Why? Because if the US doesn't do this, it's likely to lead to economic crisis overall. Insofar as a large number of countries have their debt denominated in the dollar, the US pursuing an opposite policy to this, which is what the opposition has to defend, is likely to lead to a chance of chain default in a number of countries. But even if not a chance of, even not an actual chain default, then at least a predictable chance of chain default, which creates a chilling effect within the global economy, insofar as there is a fear that US policy, because risk assessment departments know the extent of the US policy's influence, that it is going to lead to a chain default. The consequences of this are dire. This means that overall, multiple countries are not able to cash in on their debts and multiple economies crumble. It means that overall, prices rise for everyone, not just overall in the world, but also in the US, insofar as the global economy is less conducive to trade and export, meaning that domestic producers now raise their prices up, which harms the US citizen. This is how the interests compound. But thirdly, this means that investments overall are reduced. This means that companies do not do FDI, do not do greenfield investments because there is a fear of default and a fear of economic collapse, which is to say that overall US companies are unable to expand their business outside, which is a harm for the US, but it also means less investment, less employment in other countries, which is a harm for other countries as well. Note, we don't have to prove that default will happen, we just have to prove there's a larger chance of it, and it has happened in the past, given countries not being able to pay off their debts. Note multiple IMF bailouts in countries like Argentina to show there's a chilling effect on the economy globally, there's impacts on millions of people larger than anything that they might say about banking or whatever economic jargon I'm going to hear in this debate, and then probably want to puke after that. Okay. Why is this overall good for the USA? I think that the corollary of promoting a policy which has some trend of devaluation is also good for economic growth domestically. Firstly, because just basically, this means more money in the economy. More money in the economy, as long as it's not crazy inflation, means more spending. More spending engenders more demand, meaning there's more circulation of money through the economy. This money gets taxed. All of this gets redistributed and trickles down to individuals. Secondly, talk about the idea that individual people within the USA find it easier to pay their debt. Insofar as they themselves have their debt in the dollar, a devaluation of the dollar means that on an individual level, people have more disposable income from quarter to quarter. This means that at the end of the month, people are better able not just to care and fend for their lives, but also to spend within the economy, which encourages economic activity and recovery. This is incredibly important because crises like COVID are not isolated, right? We had COVID now, we had 2008, we have an oil shock due to Russia and Saudi Arabia, had multiple oil shocks before. Insofar as external crises are always likely to happen, I think having a policy which is conducive to having economic recovery as soon as those crises happen is something that is overall benefit. Thirdly, I want to claim that this encourages export, which is to say that in a situation where you have a devaluation or a trend towards devaluation, your exports become cheaper for other countries because a unit of other currency is able to buy more units of your currency. Insofar as they trade with the US in the dollar, this means it's more profitable to import commodities and goods and services from the US as opposed to other countries, which means that on economies of scale, things like startups, things like small and medium scale businesses have a larger access to exports overall, which I think encourages the US economy. An incredibly important thing to point out here is that on both sides of the house, we have a consideration of the United States interest. What we prove on our side of the house is that if you don't consider the interest of foreign economies, not only is that a harm on other countries and millions of people across the world, this is not an actor motion. So if somebody wants to run US as primary benefit, be my guest. But we secondly prove that insofar as reckless monetary policy at home can create global economic crisis cycles, which also affect the US economy. Note how global recessions like COVID, even if they don't start in the US, create recessions in the US equally that harm US exports and harm the US economy. We're also able to prove benefits for the US at the end of the day. I don't know if this is true, like in the world of economic Wikipedia. I know that they give analysis. So I invite other teams to rebut that analysis if they want to go through the semifinal. Opening government will win.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister. We are happy to call the leader of the opposition to continue.
Are you going to give them? Okay, cool.
I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, how this affects the Fed and why it is that we're going to turn all of the arguments coming from opening government and explain to you why this is much more likely going to push countries away and lead to global economic collapse. And secondly, I'm going to talk about what this likely politicizes the Fed, compounding all of the harms that OG wants to talk about. So then, firstly, how does this affect the Fed? The most important thing to understand about the Fed as a whole is the fact that it uses monetary policy in order to counterbalance either recessions or inflation within the US. But the most important thing to note about this is that it is very predictable and it responds in ways that both investors and other countries can react to. It does this through a myriad of ways, like printing money, changing the federal funds rate, etc., etc. What this means is that on their side of the house, when the Fed begins to decide its policy based off of other countries, it becomes impossible to make decisions when it comes to people on the ground. And note here the vague characterization from opening government as to exactly how this is likely going to work, right? They just vaguely say, we'll make this decision based on what might happen around the world, things that are probably likely going to be very inaccessible information. So then, how to weigh other countries? Two things. Firstly, there will always be other countries that we hurt through our monetary policies. Other countries are always affected by default when their business cycles are out of sync with the US economy. On average, at roughly half the world at any point in time will not be in sync with the US. But secondly, Secondly, this puts the US in an impossible situation where it either A, explicitly avoids the monetary policy best suited to the US business cycle, or B, does what it wants anyways and screws some countries over. There will be some cases where the Fed prioritizes this and some where it doesn't. And so it would be very nebulous when they do and when they don't. It becomes extremely hard to predict. And this is a necessary consequence of their policy. What does this mean in terms of impacts? Firstly, this collapses the investment in the US. Right now, investors can predict the Fed's movements based on the business cycle of the US. That is to say, this is likely going to create a degree of investor uncertainty that damages investments, because if investors are in a recession but expect the Fed to drop interest rates and juice the stock market, they will keep their money in the market since they know that they will be protected by the Fed's policies. If they don't know what the Fed will do or actively go in the opposite direction, they're incentivized to pull all of their money out of the market immediately in order to check back against this risk. This means that the US economy will now likely snowball into the initial direction that it takes, meaning that recessions become depressions or inflation becomes much, much higher. And then when the Fed does decide to respond, that they have to raise interest rates much more than they previously would have, and it causes recessions that otherwise wouldn't occur. Basically, it snowballs the direction of the economy in a way that investors can never have confidence, and every issue becomes much, much worse. Note that this is also true to other countries' investors, right? Collapse in the US economy is the #1 impact on other countries' economies, right? US demand for consumer goods in developing countries is the key driving force for much of the developing world. More developing countries also default when their economy as a whole struggles and has less tax revenue. So the aggregate harm from US recession to developing countries is going to be much higher, and the chances of these recessions happening is going to be much bigger, just simply because monetary policy cannot possibly be coordinated. Note this means two things. Firstly, it flips the analysis that they give us about the trust in the US dollars and the fact that countries might turn away to negative actors, right? Because when the US is known to have unreliable monetary policy and unpredictable monetary policy, it means that they are forced to invest or trade or like take their investments to other countries that bring all the impacts that OG wants to talk about. But secondly, the instability from the US and the Fed will also force the countries out, which takes away their analysis about how US investors won't be able to invest in other countries anymore, because you're much more likely going to be unstable on their side of the house. What then do we think is the comparative, right? I think there are other institutions, even US-based ones, that are likely going to be able to change this, right? And the biggest one we want to talk about is the IMF, which OG admits to us is actually good, right? For example, the IMF during COVID waived tons of loans for other countries and was able to prevent like debt crises and economic crises all around the globe. I think there's two important things to point out about the IMF, right? Firstly, that its entire existence is to be able to counterbalance the US's monetary policies that may negatively affect the other countries, e.g. the IMF may work in opposite direction of Fed oftentimes because the US is now able to properly enact monetary policy, but the IMF is able to help stabilize other countries all around the world, which the US does have the incentive to help. But secondly, note the IMF is just much more democratic and safer, needing international and global buy-in and consensus. And so it is just a better actor than the Fed, which tends to be entirely undemocratic and elitist in terms of trying to help other countries around the world. I quickly want to respond to their idea about the US collapse leading to world collapse before I get on to politicizing the Fed, right? They tell us that US collapse is very volatile, can affect the rest of the world, right? Firstly, note all of the previous analysis shows why this is more likely going to happen, considering the fact that investors can't hedge against the Fed counterbalancing against economic recessions. But secondly, note the fact that the IMF acting in unison with the Fed is much more likely going to be stable. Before I go on to the second point, I'll take a POI from closing.
How can the IMF work out these implications if they have the same bunch of economists that will end up working for the Fed too? Like, these are the most competent people in the world. Surely they can figure this out.
Yeah, but the IMF is democratic and requires global consensus, whereas the Fed is entirely run independently, democratically from the start. So secondly then, how does this politicize the Fed, and why is that bad? Firstly, I want to point out that the far left and the far right in America both don't like the Fed, right? It's very undemocratic and very elite at the same time. Central banks, however, are necessary necessary because they can override the political swings that can oftentimes force short-term monetary decisions that hurt long-term outcomes, right? So for example, the Fed oftentimes can do things like bailing out banks, which is super unpopular to the people, but could eventually do things like saving us from global recessions. The comparative on their side is they now need to rely on politicians who now have an increased incentive to try to control the Fed because of its new implications as an actor that cannot stabilize the American economy. Note two things here. Firstly, that politicians are oftentimes going to be are held accountable to a 4-year unemployment pressure, which means a lot of the decisions that they want to make are going to be countervailing to the long-term benefits of the US economy. But secondly, note the fact that the Fed hurts us in the short term and the long term in many of the cases that they want to talk about, right? Like the cases where the Fed is likely going to hurt the US population in order to help countries outside of them not to help themselves in the long term. This becomes a huge issue because it damages the ability for the Fed to hold the economy stable, and it also likely means that this offsets the ability for people to properly advocate for legislation that should have been previously checked and balanced by the Fed, but now no longer is. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, the leader of the opposition. Now it's time for Deputy